Welcome to Mastering Your World Through Frequencies. In this episode, there's an introduction, an interview, and most importantly, at the end, a group frequency calibration where the frequency work happens and change is catalyzed. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, this is Karen Cheong, and I'm here with a special guest. For those of us who've never been in a cult, they may seem strangely fascinating. Often, from an outside perspective, it seems like it's obvious that they're manipulative and oppressive, and it may seem difficult to understand how the members somehow get drawn in, even people who seem smart or normal. So how do people get pulled into cults? What does life look like on the inside of that experience, and what can we learn from them? Today we're going to be talking to Veronica, who was born into a cult and left at 16, about what it was like growing up in the cult. We're discussing her struggles since she left, what's happening on spirit level that causes that struggle in her and in others who've experienced being in a cult. Finally, we'll talk about what we can learn from the dynamics of the fear and oppression characteristic of cults, so we can claim even more sovereignty from the oppression running in the structures of the existing paradigm we all live in. And after the discussion, we get to the most important part of this episode. The group frequency calibration at the end is where the frequency work happens and where change actually occurs. So be sure to listen to that. Without releasing distortion patterns targeted by the GSC, the change you want will be more difficult to attain because you haven't addressed the root of the issue. So let's jump right in. So Veronica, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit just first, like who you are, like who are you, where do you live, what do you do, and then we'll jump into your history, if that's okay, just so people know who you are.
My name is Veronica, and I live in San Francisco, California. I work as an astrologer consultant. I feel like I have a lot of intuitive gifts that I used to my advantage. But I actually left this cult that I was born in. It was the Unification Church. So many of you guys may not know what that is, but you may know the Moonies, and they were known primarily for recruiting large amounts of Americans in the 70s and 80s, and also for arranged marriages and mass weddings, of which my parents were married in at Madison Square Garden. And it's kind of like a really strange way to, I guess, grow up in, but that's more or less what they're known for. So
okay, cool. And what was so obviously we have a dynamic leader, and what was his name again? Reverend Moon, I think. Yes.
He was basically just he called himself the Messiah, the third Messiah, and he wanted to basically accomplish that which Christ failed to do. He seemed to believe that Christ, because he was crucified, left a job undone. And so he was supposed to, bring providence to the earth by blessing couples and erasing original sin. So that's why there were these mass weddings that my family was a part of. Okay. Just to be clear, my family, when they were approached by other members of the cult, it wasn't like, hey, do you want to sign up for this cult? It was like, hey, do you want to end, war and famine? And would you like to bring about world peace? And my parents were very idealistic, and they, it was like the tail end of the 70s. And, they were like, yeah, that sounds great. World peace. And so that's kind of how they got brought into it. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And did they know each other before the wedding thingy?
No, they, in basically a big, gigantic ballroom in the New Yorker Hotel in New York City, the Messiah basically points to my dad and then points to my mom and because it's just this gigantic ballroom filled with all of these people, they just filed to the end of the ballroom. Okay. And that when they were like filing up in a line of those, and that's basically how they met each other. They were engaged for about, I think, 1.5 or 2 years beforehand to make sure that it was going to stick. They got married in like a big wedding ceremony. So.
Okay. And so the cleansing of the original sin, just so I'm clear, because I think you've shared this with me briefly, is that when they have children, then the children, because they're pure, right? They're of this like clear marriage thing, then the children are absolved of the original sin, and that does something good, right? Is that the idea?
No, it doesn't matter if you do or don't know, because it really doesn't actually matter. This is all, it's basically just, this crazy paradigm. But the idea was that, there's Adam and there's Eve. Eve seduces Adam. Suddenly there's original sin for everybody who's a human. So ostensibly, we blessed children, the ones who were born in this cult, we are spiritually superior to everyone else who is like, a member of this cult, or we're even spiritually superior to even our own parents. It's kind of a head trip, but yes, that's what it believed. So. Got it. And so what was it like when you were growing up in that? It was really strange in the sense that, and the thing is I didn't actually think that there was anything strange. It was only strange when I would compare myself to other classmates, because of course I'm in school, 5 days a week, but, the brothers, the boys in the church were called the brothers, and then the girls were called the sisters, and we more or less kept one another very separate. And because purity was, that was like the driving force, or that was the driving kernel of this paradigm, the crux of it. I mean, we were not allowed to date. We were not allowed to hold hands, like date, kissing, absolutely not okay. And it was very puritanical. I remember plenty of moms, being very, very protective and chastising anyone who had like a cardigan that was unbuttoned, even just like one button. So extremely puritanical, and it was really forced down on the girls mostly.
Well, Eve committed the original sin, so of course it's going to be harder on the girls. We're starting from it was her fault, so yeah.
It was very stifling. It was a very stifling childhood to be a part of. It was very, very strict. And then I think the boys, though, on the other hand, they grew up feeling like everything that they did was just really in response to what women did, and like less agency on their part. Because if you have the template of Eve, who, whatever she does, she's catalyzing something. You don't really have that, because if men are just really responding to the seduction of a woman or not, does that make sense?
No, I don't understand. So you mean so whether their value is based on whether they can withstand the seduction? Is that, or am I wrong?
There's just so much, agency in what a woman does, whether or not she herself decides to be, okay, I'm going to be the one that's seducing here or not, because I'm going to catalyze a narrative here. Really, it's the men were always considered like, well, in any situation, it was always going to be a woman that was going to be blamed if something did happen, you know what I mean? So it wasn't really a matter of whether or not a man was going to be seduced or not. There's this understory that's going on subliminally that I think made a lot of the brothers that I grew up in feel like they almost don't have agency within themselves, like almost like their choices and their actions don't matter as much. And it kind of created more of like an existential crisis. Whereas I myself, I always felt like I had so much power. I was almost afraid to use that power. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then what happened when you realized, oh, what made you realize you wanted to leave? And then when you tried to, what happened?
Sure. So I was actually a very, very sassy kid who at summer camp, I was always the one that was like playing pranks on anybody really. But I was also asking really, really very good questions, I think, but very annoying for anyone who was trying to create like, a religious lesson plan. And, I'd always ask like, why is that the case? Or why do we have to do this? Or why is it like that? And that kind of got me in trouble. So when I was 16, I was traveling in a youth group organization that was pretending to be a non-sectarian organization. And maybe you guys wouldn't realize this, but our church was constantly using obfuscation to, try to bring in new members or new memberships.
Oh.
Always like a game of smoke and mirrors. Like, here's this going on over here. We're going to try and bring in, I'm not really actually quite sure why they do this. It didn't make sense to me, even at that age. So I remember telling or asking the leaders, hey, like, why do we say that we're non-sectarian when very clearly we are, just this church? Like, why do we have to lie?
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. There's a lot of imposter syndrome for kids who've left our church. Like, for whatever reason, we think that we're always faking it, even if we're not, But anyways, I had asked these leaders like, hey, like, why do we have to do this? And they really didn't like that question. And I recall there were even some kids who were outside of our church who had fallen for this, and they had joined our organization and they were being forced to do our rituals, which was reading from our version of the Bible, waking up at 5 a.m. to do certain prayers or whatnot. They didn't realize this because that's what we were just all doing. And I said, hey, if we're really non-sectarian, these kids have the right to abstain and we should give them that choice. And the leaders were like, you don't understand, there's God's work, you clearly, this is like above your intelligence. And I really dug down and said, no, this is really like, if this is the case, then I am not going to be reading the divine principle. I am not waking up at 5 a.m. to do these rituals. So that was when they kind of flipped the script on me, and suddenly it got very dangerous. They put me into isolation away from any of the other kids that we were traveling with. This was also traveling abroad. We were at the time in Germany, and they had my passport. I had no means of communicating with my parents, but they put me in isolation, kept me away from food. They wouldn't let me sleep, and they would spend hours trying to have someone like mentally break me. But I'm somebody who's very stubborn. Like if you try to dig down into me, I really like dig my heels in. So I got very sick from that. And then I actually had a near-death experience, or an NDE. And then after that,
On that trip or after?
On that trip, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a really, I know that near-death experiences are a totally different podcast that I'm sure you'll explore down the road. But after that, I realized I was like, wow, this entire system is a total joke. I need to get out of here. I was really grateful for that experience. I also, from the NDE, like, if any of your listeners know what that is like, you really do get a peek behind the veil of everything. And, I could simultaneously see just how completely insignificant this organization was, even though it was looming so large in my, in my childhood. And but I was really more moved by the force of, I guess, what is pure source. Like, that's what I was being absorbed back into. Anyway, so that was, I had like a little glimpse of that. I went back home. My parents left the church after I did. And I, had such a vengeance to do well, to be successful, to really just make the most of my life, because I thought that I had almost lost it. So I was going to really give my all and throw everything into being happy and successful, because I think that that was maybe the best revenge, let's say. And I think that it was really difficult because, afterwards I went to the public library looking for any books on, how do you reprogram yourself after you leave a cult? And they were all written for people who, weren't born in cults, like they had something to go back to, like, here, you just go back to this other program that you had, before you joined. And that wasn't the case for me because I was born in it. So it was kind of hard. And it is really difficult to trust therapists or psychologists, because I think that they also I felt like they could sometimes, look at us sort of like as these exotic weirdos. Yeah.
Yeah, totally, because they have an idea of what a cult is, right? And they're projecting their own story onto you. So now you're bound within their story, the frequencies of their story. So I can totally see that. And would you mind sharing with us, you went through this period where you had the gift of the near death, right? Saw how insignificant it was, so that gave you the courage to leave it, really, in a way, because you had something from a bigger perspective. After that experience, when you were with them, what have you, since you've left, like what do you find that you struggled with the most? I know you said that you got sick. What have you struggled with? I mean, you said the imposter syndrome was there. It's hard to trust therapists because, they project whatever they have on you. Can you share a little bit about what you struggled with and what you see other people like you who have struggled with? I mean, that's what catalyzed the discussion. So I'm curious.
Time with really getting into big groups of really anything. Like I'm very skeptical of, and I think that actually there is like a healthy skepticism, because I'm like, wait a second, what is this Kool-Aid that everyone is drinking over here? Then there's, really just being able to trust and fall into a relationship, because, I was always told, like, hey, you're going to have an arranged marriage just like your parents and just like your friends. And have this one person that you're going to spend the rest of eternity with, and it's all figured out for you. And so dating is like, this whole other thing that was very difficult. And, it's a sore spot for a lot of the kids who also left the same cult as me. Financial abundance is really, really hard, because, that cult itself was one that really kept all of these families, all of these people who are born into it, under the thumb of this very oppressive poverty. It wasn't uncommon for kids who were in the church, to be one of 4 or 5, or even sometimes as much as 8 children in a household. And they would be, on food stamps, because the family is giving away their money to the church, or, you know, they're being paid very little because they're working literally just for the church. So it's really difficult because we, you know, a lot of us coming out, we're like, we don't know how to manage money. We don't know how to like balance a checkbook. We don't know how to like manage a credit card, you know? So there's like some very real tangible things like that. But I would say the most difficult thing is, and I'm using the term that I learned from you, is really being comfortable with our own brilliance. Because I think so much of that, you know, a lot of, you know, our ability to, you know, really relate with another person, be financially abundant, you know, it stems from our ability to be comfortable with our own brilliance. And a lot of that was like squashed down constantly in the church. So
Yeah, well, that's because just from a frequency perspective, you're right. I mean, it has to, because what they're doing, actually, it's not just squashed, it's actually siphoned off. So they're actually like, it's like a feeding, right? So it's like you have, you know, it's like a pyramid, and you have one entity or source that's like pulling from so many, right? A lot of times when you have things that are dark like this, you'll have an entity that moves through a person, right, to start to control others. And it requires like a lot of pull from all these different sources of life force or bioenergy. And so in a cult like this, they're also starting to feed not only on your bioenergy, which will start to, which is why vitality or abundance is difficult, because they're like pulling away your life force, which is actually intertwined to some degree with abundance and ability to receive it. They're also pulling on you, on your spiritual sort of like brilliance itself, which is more insidious actually. And because it's not yours, right? It belongs to them. So therefore they can pull on it, and which is really not cool, and not, it sort of violates a lot of universal laws in terms of being able to siphon that away from you. Does that make sense? It's like they're taking a piece of your spirit, which is a violation, actually. So it's hard to leave because, well, you don't feel complete when you leave because they have a little piece of you. Because they do. I mean, that's what the siphoning of the spirit body or the spirit will do. It can make the, you know, the people who leave feel sort of like not quite whole, like they're missing something, even though they've left and they've wanted to, etc. And it's hard because they're so used to the dynamic, or the programming often is where you're used to a certain type of spirit debt, right? Like you have to give, like you're just conditioned to it. It's like you have to give your life force and it's part of your spirit in order to have, you know, God, basically, you know, a worthiness, purity, or whatever it is that the term is. But that's the exchange. And so when you leave, it's just like, well, it's like a bit lost, right? You're like, well, who am I'm still giving this. Who am I giving it to though? I don't want to give it to them, but I'm not really worthy of it. So how do I deal with this? And how do I receive abundance? Because still I'm not worthy of it. And I'm supposed to give it to someone else. So it just makes it very confusing. So yeah, that's in part what I see when I tap into you guys. I mean, the people who left anyway. Yeah.
Interesting. That's super fascinating, because I remember in IFC you had told me that somehow, even though I had, you know, it was like over, I don't know, like 20 years since I had left, but that somehow the leader of our cult was still messing with my rendering.
Yeah.
Can you actually explain, is that what you just explained just now?
Yes, exactly. So there are, thank you for asking. So a lot of times when you have cults, or you have a very, very charismatic leader like that, and there's an entity that's powerful, or sometimes it's an alien, whatever, but something, okay, that's dark, that's moving through them. What they'll do is something which is actually a very, like I said, an intrusion and a very great violation. So just to back up, for those of you who are not aware, right? So you have your spirit body, which is a sphere at arm's length all around you. And then it projects like a hologram, your physical body in its center, right? So there you are. And then your brain is the mechanism or the projector for your physical body, your reality, etc. Okay? So the rendering of you is, like I said, it's a hologram. And so it's a reflection of what's being projected by your spirit body. There are some entities and some alien beings that will come in and actually, so it's like a code, right? So your spirit body is like running code, but it's not really code like a computer. It's more like light code, but whatever. It's just coding, yeah? Like coding, coding, like a computer code. And it's rendering this thing. And you typically would have free will. You have sovereignty. It's diminished to some degree because all of us have distortion patterns, but you have sovereignty typically. But what happens is when you have something like a cult or a charismatic leader who is imposing control in this way, they actually will intertwine with the spirit body and start to hijack the rendering. Does that make sense? They're like getting into the coding of the spirit body that projects the rendering. This is a really huge violation. Okay, like they should not be interfering at that level. It's really not, it's not permissible, really. It's not okay that they're doing at that level, because it takes away your ability to like separate from them, because it's so intertwined. Does that make sense? They're like right in there, enmeshed with the thing that creates you, which gives them a lot more control over all aspects of you, right? From physical all the way out to spirit. Because now, does that make sense? They're at the source point of what creates your reality. So that is a huge violation, and it's hard for me to convey what that means, really, but that is a challenge. It's why, as you said, even 20 years later, you're like, it's still sticky. You know what I mean? You're just like, why can't I get rid of some of this stuff? Like, I just can't break free. I'm doing all this stuff and I can't seem to. That's because they're intertwined, like I said, in the spirit body, in the rendering. Until you unhook that, really, it's hard to be free, even though you physically left, right? You're physically left, you don't talk to them, you don't have anything to do with them anymore. It has nothing to do with the physicalness. It has to do with unhooking their oppression over you, or their quote unquote right to your bioenergy and your spirit essence. So that's what I was talking about. And it's a really, I don't know how else you would do it, honestly, if you didn't have frequency work. I don't know any other mechanism for which the unhooking can happen at that level, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
I mean, just to point out, I actually, spent years and years and years doing, I feel like, everything under the sun. I was doing hypnosis on myself, and I think that was somewhat helpful, but it wasn't actually really getting to it the way that frequency work was. And that's why I was so excited to come to you to really talk about this. So anyways.
Yeah, totally. And do you have any other questions for me? That was a great one. I don't know how we came down the path, but it's a good one. So
yeah, absolutely. So many other people who are born in and later left my cult have a very hard time interfacing with anything or even anyone spiritual. Spirituality seems to be really triggering, especially when it seems that all of the New Age movement really seems laden with landmines of very charismatic leaders or gurus that, are like, here, come in and, like, let me take a little piece of that light of yours. So do you have any advice?
Yeah. So in some ways that's kind of good, to be honest, because you're right, there is a lot of that in the New Age movement. And there are a lot of people who are darker, who masquerade as the light, right? And so in a way, your hypersensitivity to that is good, because you have a healthy dose of skepticism. A lot of people say they can do different things, and you're like, can you really? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. What's difficult, the greater challenge is to, as you say, recognize your own brilliance. So whenever you find a modality that works for you, right, that's not dependent like on a person being elevated in a particular way or whatever, that you can do the work yourself, whatever the modality is, it doesn't really matter. But when you find that, the difficulty is to go into the surrender, right, of the allowing for yourself to recognize your own brilliance, your own power, to allow yourself to drop into that surrender, which is hard, right? When you have a little post-traumatic stress disorder from being in a place where that was abused. If you still have those hooks, even harder, right? Because it's almost like somebody else has claimed you as theirs. Does that make sense? So because they have claim on you, you don't have claim on you. I know it sounds weird, but when they have their hooks, you can't, does that make sense? You don't have authority over yourself, which sounds like, well, how is that possible? It's possible when they're doing it at that level. So until you release that, it's hard for you to be like, oh my God, I have sovereignty over me. Does that make sense? Like I have a power, like, which is an important thing in any kind of, well, from my perspective anyway, in any kind of awakening process, right? Because then that allows you to drop into the neutrality, the surrender, all that sort of stuff that's required for the ascension, and also to see more clearly the distortion patterns that are there. So it causes this sort of like it makes it harder. But so on the one hand, it's good. On the other hand, it can make it more difficult if you can unhook those fundamental, like that claiming of your spirit body, then you can move forward and have more freedom. And also what's awesome is that you have, even if you do something like frequency work, you get more and more clear on where the BS is, right? You're just like really clear on like, okay, well, that doesn't resonate with me. And the wonderful thing about frequency work is that you can also empowers you to be like, okay, well, most of that doesn't resonate with me, but this one little piece here, I actually find interesting. This one little piece, that's a little piece that I'm going to take with me right now. But the rest I'm going to leave. So it doesn't have to become, because you become more strong internally, right? You become complete. You recognize your own completion. You don't need to have it given to you by the leader or the organization or anything. You are complete. You have your own connection to pure source. That is everything. That is everything. I mean, you recognize more and more. You're like, I don't need any of this structure. I just need me. Then what happens is that then you can really sort of take off in terms of your frequency resonance, because you recognize that those structures aren't there anymore, and you recognize your own authority, which is important, I think. So I don't know if I answered your question, Veronica. I kind of like went like this.
That's really, really beautiful. And I think that that's actually what we really, I think, resonate with is, I mean, trying to do something for ourselves that we can do, by ourselves almost. I mean, obviously, yes. With the help of somebody whose frequency is really like able to bring ours up. But that is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, please.
So, my perception after having left the cult, it's actually really interesting how I would say that the cult that I was in, that was like a pressure cooker of oppression, let's say. Like it was just really like laden heavily with it. But what about situations where it's not so clear cut or even obvious? How can we better discern cult-like situations?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking like even organizations or jobs that we've had, or maybe even like familial family structures, or what is your advice for discerning, like a cult?
Yeah. So what I would say is a couple of things. One is to release the oppression frequencies within self, right? Because the first step is that, because the thing is, if you don't release those first, now I'm not saying for you because you've already done this, like if you have those running, you're just going to call more of those realities to you, right? Where you have situations that are oppressive, whether it's in relationship, work, social, it doesn't really matter, right? So if you have those oppression frequencies running in you strongly, so the thing is, frequencies often have like let's call it two ends to them, right? The oppression, like you either oppress or oppression happens to you. Okay, so either way, that's the two ways it sort of shows up. So once you start to release that more, right? So people who would first come to me, that's the first thing to start to release. Okay, so that, and why is that important? Like I said, because you're broadcasting these frequencies. This is the frequency that's running in you. So you're going to call something that's going to oppress you. So that's the first thing, right? To release that. Okay, because even if you're aware and you're like, why does this keep happening? Does that make sense? The awareness by itself isn't enough until you release those oppression patterns within self, yeah? Okay, so that's the first thing. So the first thing is to release within self. What will happen is you will notice when you have your own tendencies to want to control, when others want to control, and when you have situations where others try to control you, it's to recognize, okay, well, what's really going on here? Why? So I'm noticing that I'm having a response to this, which is resistance. Okay, so the resistance isn't necessarily bad. So it's to examine, right? To have a lot of self-awareness. Why am I resisting? Am I just resisting because I'm rebelling, or why is that happening? So then, okay, so it feels like control to me. What is the purpose behind the control? That's another question to ask. What is it? Is it just because, they're a bigger organization and they're just trying to, create some kind of structure for everybody? Okay. And then to assess, is that something I want to participate in? Right? So it's just sort of like, it's like further refinement of your own, what it is that you want to sort of experience. And if you can, within that parameter, create a dynamic where you don't feel that oppression, right? Because that's really, don't forget, you're creating your reality, right? So can you clear enough that in your interface with whatever that is, that control doesn't happen? Does that make sense? Just because so the structure could be generally controlling, but if you yourself are strong enough and complete enough and high enough in resonance, you can get to the point where you have an interaction with that dynamic where it is not running, that in your dynamic with that, the oppression isn't existing. Does that make sense? Like, it's fine with you. You don't feel oppressed. They're not oppressing you. You're not controlling. It's good. And then what can happen sometimes, or especially if your resonance is high enough, is the dynamic of the whole organization starts to shift because of you, because of your resonance. Now, are you required to do this? No, not meaning you, Veronica, but is one required to do this to like save the world? No. Okay. So only do this if you feel like it's good for you. If not, you have to assess, do I really want to participate in this? Whether it's a relationship, a larger structure, whatever, and so that's what I would say. So part of the discernment, so I answered it a little bit more broadly than what you asked, but part of the discernment is to recognize first oppression within self, clear. Then to ask why, when you have a reaction, to notice that, not get triggered in the reaction, but to notice the reaction and be like, okay, I'm resisting. Why? What is the mechanism of control that I'm resisting? Why is it being implemented? Do I want to engage or not? Can I hold my resonance enough that I can engage in a way that it doesn't oppress me personally? Okay, this takes a very high level of self-awareness. If so, do I want to engage or not? Does that make sense? So it just requires like more and more nuance. And as you rise in frequency resonance, those choices become clearer. Okay. Yeah. And you're more able to discern. And the other thing is permission to like, okay, I'm a little in over my head. No, it's not feeling okay to me. I need to back out here. Right. So that's what I would suggest. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah.
That's really, really helpful. I think especially given how polarizing really just like the collective consciousness feels like right now too, that seems such words of wisdom, just from my perspective.
Yeah. And just to know, like, and you mentioned this, right? The near-death experience gave you a perspective that was much broader, because as you merged into that space, you start to recognize your big S self, right? What we've talked about a lot in terms of your identity as infinite, indestructible consciousness. So when you came back, you recognized that. You're like, whoa, I'm greater than this me as this human. So it's to also recognize that, like, not only from like an ego perspective, like how am I in this interplay of control, but also to cultivate more of this bigger perspective of the big S self, right? You see all the polarity, you see all the dynamic, right? Does that make sense? And you don't get pulled into it. So the more you can cultivate that big S self perspective, which requires releasing the distortion patterns, right? We talk about this a lot in Coherence Mastery for anybody who's interested in that, but that's what we're cultivating, that perspective of the big S self. So you can recognize, okay, well, is it, because in our little ego mind self, it could be really important. Like if we don't conform to this, then we're going to create all these issues in our relationships, or work is going to be really sticky or whatever. Right. And then from the big S self, it's like, is it really worth it to me from this perspective, given the infiniteness of everything? Like what's really important to me? in terms of moving forward. And of course, you'll have human considerations, but with that perspective, it somehow lends clarity. So at least from my perspective, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Cool. Let me ask you one very pointed question for the end, if that's okay. So for those listening who came from a situation like yours or an experience like yours, can you share with them how frequency work has helped you, just like in concrete terms, so they can sort of understand what that is?
So I think I explained, like I've been on a mission since I left the cult at 16, really trying to get my hands on anything that might be able to help me, but I always resonated the most with anything that I could do for myself. And I, really resisted joining other spiritual movements or practices, really across the gamut. And, I really liked the idea of really, I think any kind of modality where I could, administer this or have control over the experience for myself, because I was having such a hard time with really trusting other people and their motivations, so this kind of really ex-nayed the like any working with therapists and psychologists. And I don't besmirch or I think that they're a great option for everybody else, but it is, I think, for people who are coming from my situation, it may not be the best option. And so I think I mentioned that I was, more recently, just before discovering frequency work, I was, administering hypnosis for myself. And that I thought that was like a huge breakthrough for me. But with frequency work, I really love that I own my entire experience. And in the sense that I am responsible for that journey, I cannot, if something isn't really meshing, I only have myself to really ask, like, okay, what's going on here? What am I doing wrong? What am I not seeing clearly? If something is especially crunchy, as you like to say, Karen. So it's the onus is really on me, and that is both terrifying but also invigorating because it's all mine. And that is something that because when you come from an organization where you're sharing everything and you don't want to let down the collective, et cetera, because you're sharing everything, and everything is, you don't really have anything because if you're in a cult, you're like, literally, you're just like absorbed into this ocean of otherness. That is actually, it's so brilliant to be able to have, this corner that is mine, and that responsibility. So I find that to be a really brilliant upside, or at least that's how I like to look at it. But it's by no means easy. I don't think, I think that it's easy once I began to let go of a few distortions. But of course, I had to confirm the deletion. I had to be like, okay, do I still have this? No, I had to really churn out and work on it myself, but it feels like progress to me because I can suddenly look back 2 weeks later after I do a GFC or an IFC. I'm like, wow, I'm not dwelling on this thing or this tick I had. I don't have that anymore. I feel more free. I just feel more at ease. So I'm still working on it. And I think that I still have a ways to go, but this is, I've gone, the amount of area I've covered in just 2 years, I feel like I probably would have done it in maybe 30 years. I don't know if I would have even, that's how much ground I've covered. And that I think is just extraordinary. So I really am just so amazed at like what a gift that I've been giving myself by devoting myself to this. So that's why I was really excited to, you know, like share this with Karen. I was like, how can I get this in the hands of people who have been through what I have been through? Yeah. So
yeah, it's awesome. And Veronica had actually offered to even like financially, before she knew that we were going to do this podcast, to actually commission a deep dive, which is very generous of her. And so that's how committed she is to this, to helping, which is really very generous of her. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, what changes have you noticed in terms of like how you feel since you started frequency work? Can you tell like from before and after, like what the difference is for you, the changes, whether you feel it or how they've shown up, just what's been like for you?
I mean, as I said, I'm still working on things. Like I'm still discovering like what surrender feels like. You know, I'm like, oh my God, I thought I was surrendered, but I guess not really, because you know, this must be what surrender really feels like. And it is really just extraordinary because, you know, when I was listening to you saying like, oh, like this is sovereignty, like it's really hard for somebody who never had that, like at the get-go, you know, from birth, you know, into adulthood, never really felt like the fullness of, you know, his or her sovereignty, um, to be able to like really actually feel these things. It's extraordinary to begin to feel the edges of that. And I know I have a ways to go, and you know, I'm trying to, you know, keep myself measured when I'm looking at that. But it makes me really excited as far as how much further I could go. Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Veronica, for sharing your story and for wanting to, and for being the catalyst for this and for wanting to help others. And we hope that this is, we being all of us at the Spherical Luminosity team, hope this helps others and to break free from what you've broken free from and to gain more and more sovereignty, which is really amazing to witness in you. So thank you for having the courage to ask and to speak up and to do the work and being on the journey that you're on. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen.
All right.
So we're about to start the group frequency calibration, where we actually do the frequency work and where change is catalyzed. To get to the GFC, click on the square that'll appear to the right or the link in the description below. Because I'm working on frequency level, GFCs are not like regular meditations. Many people go into a somewhat altered state, so please don't drive while listening to this. It's time to bring in a new experience, a new consciousness, and a new world. Let's rise together.